All right, so buckle up, because we are headed straight back to 1973 for this deep dive.
Oh, yeah, 1973.
It's the year avocado green was like the height of fashion, bell-bottoms were groovy, and ideas about priesthood responsibility, well, let's just say, a little different back then.
Definitely feels like a time capsule, doesn't it?
Totally. And you know what we're cracking open today? This speech, Priesthood Responsibilities.
Oh, classic.
Right, given by this guy, President N. Eldon Tanner. Now, I don't know if that name rings a bell for everyone listening, but think of it like he's a high-ranking figure in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Big deal in that world.
Exactly. Now picture it, 1973. The world's changing fast, right? Even these traditional institutions are feeling the shakeup. So what's going on, big picture, that makes this speech so important.
You're right. It was a time of huge upheaval. You've got, the Vietnam War ending, Watergate brewing. Societal norms are shifting like crazy.
Yeah.
And in the midst of all that, you have N. Eldon Tanner, who is this, like you said, high-ranking figure, speaking to a massive gathering of priesthood holders.
Okay, so we're not talking about like a small prayer group here.
Right. It's men and boys, 12 and up,
Wow.
all gathered specifically to hear this message.
So this wasn't just like your average Sunday service. This was an event.
It was a major address
Yeah.
meant to set the tone,
High stakes. Okay, so what's the heart of Tanner's message then? What's he telling all these people?
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
He's challenging them to really live up to their priesthood responsibilities.
Okay, but he doesn't just like come out and say, be responsible, does he?
No, not at all. Tanner, he's not one for ambiguity. He really emphasizes this idea that being given the priesthood, it's not some kind of like honorary title you just get to wear.
It's not just showing up in the right outfit on Sunday.
Exactly. He uses this phrase over and over, magnify the priesthood.
Magnify. That's a strong word. What's that even mean?
It means to make your faith an active force in the world, to really embody it, not just talk about it, but be a living example.
Walk the walk, huh?
Precisely. Actions speak louder than words.
Okay, I like it. So being a good example, that's a big part of it. But what about family? Because Tanner had some pretty specific ideas about family life too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where, understanding that 1973 context is so important, because today some of what he says about family might sound, well, a little outdated.
Yeah, when you were sitting over this speech, I was like, whoa, flashback to the 70s.
Right. But at the time, this was the norm. Tanner, he's very much emphasizing the traditional family structure. Fathers as the head of the household, the primary decision makers.
And moms.
Their roles are, a little less defined, let's say. It's definitely a different world back then.
Definitely. Makes you appreciate how much things have shifted, even in just a few decades.
It really does. But, even within that framework, there are these timeless values that Tanner emphasizes, like love within the family, honesty, keeping the Sabbath day holy.
Okay, so some things never go out of style.
Right. And I think it's fascinating to see, what overlaps with today's values and what feels very much of that era.
It's like this weird mix of familiar and foreign. So you've got be a good person, prioritize your family, got it. But then Tanner launches into this whole thing about preparing for the temple.
Right.
Which, for anyone who's not familiar, the temple is a super sacred place for Latter-day Saints, right? It's where they do these special ceremonies and make serious commitments to God.
Exactly.
But what got me was how he talked about it. It wasn't this scary fire and brimstone kind of way. It was almost like excited.
What do you mean?
Like he tells the story about this dad preparing his son for the temple, but it's not all, you better be worthy and all that. It's more like the dad is trying to get his son pumped about it, like he's going to Disney World or something.
That's a really interesting observation. And you're right, it is subtle. But what Tanner's doing there is advocating for a specific kind of religious teaching.
Not just what you teach, but how you teach it.
Yes. It's not about fear and obligation.
Yeah.
It's about positive anticipation, about making those temple covenants something to look forward to, a privilege and a blessing.
It's like that whole catch more flies with honey thing, but applied to, like, faith. Instead of, you better be worthy to go to the temple, it's, you're going to love what the temple represents.
Exactly.
Clever. Okay, so we've got the positive reinforcement angle, but then things get real. He starts talking directly to the bishop.
Well, yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road.
What's he telling them? Like, what's the bishop's role in all of this?
Buckle up, because Tanner does not hold back. He tells them straight up, you need to know every single boy by name. Be deeply involved in their lives. No pressure, right?
Yeah.
But then he drops his bombshell. Bishops have the power to withhold a recommendation for priesthood advancement.
Whoa, hold up. Time out for a quick translation for those of us who aren't fluent in Latter-day Saint lingo. What does that mean? Priesthood advancement.
Good point. It's easy to get lost in the jargon. So basically, think of it like leveling up in the church.
Like a video game.
Exactly. At certain ages, men and boys can receive more responsibilities, take on new roles, but to do that, they need a recommendation from their bishop.
Kind of like a teacher signing off on you moving to the next grade.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So the bishop gets to decide who's ready to level up. But what does that even mean to be worthy of that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Because
Yeah.
it's all about living up to the church's standards, being morally clean, following the rules, all of that.
Sounds pretty straightforward. But I'm guessing there's some nuance in there.
Oh, you better believe it. The criteria for that worthiness, that's where things can get, shall we say, subjective.
Oh, boy. So the bishop's got a lot of power here. He's like the gatekeeper to the next level.
You can say that again. And you know what? Tanner knows it too. He's very clearly telling these bishops, this is serious business, folks. Don't take it lightly.
With great power comes great responsibility, right?
It really highlights how much weight those local leaders carried, and in many ways still carry today.
No pressure, bishops.
Right. But seriously, it's a big deal. Okay, so we've got bishops acting as these gatekeepers to priesthood advancement.
But it gets even more intense, right? Because Tanner doesn't stop there.
Oh, no, he doesn't. He's just getting warmed up.
He goes on to lay down the law about sin and discipline. And let me tell you, he's not messing around.
Not even a little bit. He's like, all right, gentlemen, here's the deal. He gives this whole laundry list of transgressions. We're talking adultery, we're talking opposing church teachings, you name it, he's laying it out there.
Okay, so he's not sugarcoating anything.
And he's crystal clear. Bishops have to address these issues head on. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Tough love, 1973 style.
Exactly. Tanner, he's walking this tightrope between compassion and upholding these really strict moral standards of the time.
It's like you have to love the sinner, but hate the sin.
Right. And I think that tension, that balance between grace and accountability, it's something that continues to be debated and wrestled with today in all sorts of contexts.
Makes you think, huh. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of societal change, this call to action for priesthood holders, this emphasis on family, and now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of sin and discipline. Man, this speech is like a whole roller coaster.
Yeah, it doesn't let up, but that's what makes it so fascinating to unpack, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the words themselves, it's about what they tell us about the time, the culture, and the expectations placed on people back then.
And how some of those things have stayed the same and some things have drastically changed. All right, so we're just scratching the surface here, folks, but we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're diving even deeper into the nitty-gritty of what it meant to be a priesthood holder in 1973. Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive back into 1973.
Back to the future of, well, exactly. And, one thing that really stood out in this next section of Tanner's speech, he starts talking about young men and this idea of being morally clean and respectful towards women.
Yeah, that's a big theme throughout.
Which, okay, on the surface sounds great, right? Like, who's going to argue with being respectful? But then it gets a little, I don't know.
A little tricky.
Yeah, because he adds this whole bit about how young women should feel safe going out with a priesthood holder.
Oh, yeah. I see where you're going with this.
It's like, on the one hand, he's saying all the right things about respectful relationships, but on the other hand, it kind of feels like he's putting the responsibility on women to be protected rather than on men to just, like, not be jerks.
You've put your finger on a really interesting tension there. Because, yeah, we're looking at this through a 2023 lens, but back then, it was a different world, you know?
Oh, totally. And we're not trying to, like, cancel anyone from the past or anything.
Right, context is everything. But it's still worth noting, like, those assumptions baked in.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, Cantor's saying, be respectful. But it's almost like he's also saying, and part of that respect is assuming women need your protection.
Which I think we can all agree, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right. It's that whole thing of, like, women shouldn't need a bodyguard. They should just be able to exist without fear. Respect means everyone gets to just be.
Yes. And it makes me think about how far we've come in some ways, but also how much those old ways of thinking can still linger.
Oh, absolutely. It's a good reminder to be mindful of the language we use, even when our intentions are good, because those words, they carry weight, you know? They shape how we see the world and how we treat each other.
So true. Words matter. All right, so we've got this whole conversation about respect, but then Tanner takes it even further. He starts talking about these missionaries who got sent home.
Oh, yeah. Not exactly the highlight reel of missionary life, huh?
Not even close. And he doesn't hold back. He's basically saying, if you're out there representing the church, you better be walking the walk. No exceptions.
It's that personal accountability thing again. You can't just talk a big game.
No faking it till you make it.
Nope. And I think that's actually a really relevant message, even today. Because it's easy to get caught up in appearances, right?
Mhm.
To worry more about looking the part than actually being the part.
Oh, 100%. Social media's probably made that even worse, right?
Right. It's all about the highlight reel.
Mm.
But what Tanner's saying is true integrity. That comes from within. It's about aligning your actions with your values, even when no one's watching.
Easier said than done someday.
For sure. But I think that's the goal, right? To live in a way that we can be proud of, even when no one's around to give us a pat on the back.
Yeah, that's a good goal to strive for. So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've got this call to action for priesthood holders. We've got this deep dive into family dynamics, 1973 edition, of course. And now we're getting into this really intense conversation about sin, discipline, personal accountability. Is there anything else that really jumps out at you from this section?
You know, it's funny you should say that because
Yeah.
there is something, it's actually something that surprised me a little bit, given, the whole 1973 of it all. Well, remember how Tanner talks about those missionaries who were sent home and how he's really emphasizing the importance of like being worthy, living up to the church's standards, all of that.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
Right. But here's the thing.
Right.
He also talks about the need for compassion.
Compassion for the people who messed up.
Exactly. He's very clear that while bishops have a duty to uphold the standards, they also have a duty to love and support those who strayed.
So it's not just about punishment, it's about helping people get back on track.
Right. And I think that's a really important nuance because it would have been easy, especially in that time period, to just focus on the judgment, the you're either in or you're out mentality.
Which, let's be real, we still see that a lot today, even outside of religion.
Oh, totally. But I think what Tanner's getting at is this idea that we're all human. We all make mistakes. And yeah, there might be consequences, but there should also be this space for forgiveness, for second chances.
It's like that whole love the sinner, hate the sin thing again.
Exactly. And I think it speaks to this idea that true leadership, true discipleship, whatever you want to call it, it has to have both sides, the accountability and the compassion.
Got to have that balance, that understanding that we're all works in progress.
Exactly. And, it makes me think about how often we forget that, especially when we're talking about issues that are really emotionally charged or morally complex.
It's easy to get caught up in the black and white, the right, wrong.
Right. And Tanner's reminding us, hey, there's a lot of gray area in between. And sometimes the most important thing is to lead with love.
Deep stuff. And you know what? I think this is the perfect place to take another quick break. We're going to unpack even more of Tanner's message when we come back, so don't touch that dial.
It's kind of funny when you think about it.
And what's that?
This whole thing, this whole deep dive, it's been
Like what?
like holding up a mirror, to 1973.
Oh, I like that. Seeing ourselves in the reflection, but also seeing how much has changed.
Exactly. Like, we're not just summarizing these old speeches. We're having a conversation with them, trying to figure out what they still have to say to us all these years later.
And let me tell you, folks, this conversation, it's been lively.
To say the least.
But one thing that's really stuck with me through all of this, and it comes up again and again in Tanner's speech, is this idea that priesthood, it's not passive. It's about action.
Yeah. It's not just a title you wear. It's something you do.
It's like that old saying, talk is cheap. Tanner was all about walking the walk, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He wanted to see people living their faith, not just talking about it. And you know what? I think that's something we can all relate to, regardless of our beliefs. It's that difference between saying and doing.
It's so easy to talk a big game, right? But to actually put in the work, to live by the principles you claim to believe in, that's where the rubber meets the road.
100%.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, how often do we fall short of that ourselves?
More often than we'd like to admit, probably.
Right. It's a good reminder to check ourselves, to
Yeah.
make sure we're actually living up to the ideals we hold dear.
Because like you were saying earlier, words matter.
They do. And our actions. They speak even louder.
Okay, so for everyone listening, let's bring this whole thing home. We've taken a deep dive into 1973, into the world of priesthood responsibilities as laid out by President Tanner.
We've explored the complexities of faith and family, the weight of leadership, and this call to not just be good, but to do good.
We've laughed, we've learned, we've maybe even cringed a little along the way.
I think it's safe to say we've all learned a thing or two about 1973 and maybe even about ourselves.
And on that note, here's a little something to ponder as you go about your day. Think about the groups you're a part of, the ones that really matter to you. Are they living up to their own ideals? And maybe even more importantly, are you? Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.